Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. We want you to remember that you are fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God, and you are fully loved by Him.
You have been designed on purpose by God with unique gifts and passions in order to love and lead those around you. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, a pastor's wife, business owner, mom, and writer.
And I'm Esther's co-host, Holly Kane. I'm a wife, mom, and business owner. I also write at hollykane.org, where I focus on my passion for women's ministry.
Together, we chat about important issues that Christian women leaders face. In addition, we interview other women just like you who lead in various roles, from church to community to business. Through this podcast, we offer you encouragement, tools, and resources to help you on your leadership journey. We are so glad you're here with us. Hi, friend, and welcome to this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. Have you ever found yourself in a leadership situation where you were leading a group to accomplish a task, but balls were being dropped, people were not completing their work in the way that you wanted, and it was just driving you crazy? You maybe started to feel like you just need to do it all yourself because this mission is too important for things to be messed up. Can you relate to that? Or maybe you've been in a situation where you look around at other leaders and you see them doing things and they're hitting their goals, and you find yourself thinking, why can't I seem to get where they are? Why didn't I get that promotion? Or how come her business is growing faster than mine? I'm working just as hard. Well, it's likely that you have felt either one of these things, or perhaps both at some point. And today, our guest, Shannon Popkin, is going to reveal to us two major challenges that can destroy or negatively impact our leadership. And they are comparison and control. So she's going to share with us what we can do to reverse these issues and respond differently to these challenges. Plus, Shannon shares some unique perspectives on how inferiority and superiority can produce comparison and how this can play out in our organizations. She brings some tough love to us around the issue of how we can deal with disagreements and different perspectives. And I think it is super relevant in the time that we are living right now within our church and within our culture, where there is so much division. And she's going to share with us the difference between uniformity and unity. So I know you're going to love this conversation as much as Holly and I did. I can't wait for you to hear from Shannon. Before we jump in, I'm going to share with you our sponsor for today, and that is my Confident Conversations mini course. Now, you know that being a leader often involves having difficult conversations, whether it's with somebody who is someone you're leading or someone who is above you in leadership, or maybe a coworker or a friend. These conversations can sometimes be difficult because we don't want to hurt people, and we also want to make sure that we are preserving the relationship whenever possible. So I have created this Confident Conversations mini course to help you initiate and lead hard conversations as a Christian woman. Even if you struggle with confrontation, you aren't sure what to say, and you want to avoid hurting people in the process. So you can grab this mini course, which is a completely digital course. It has videos, it has PDFs, it has scripts, all kinds of resources for you as a leader. And you can go to confidentconversations.co to get all the details and to grab it for yourself. Again, find the link in the show notes or go to confidentconversations.co to learn more. All right, let's jump into our conversation with Shannon Popkin. All right. Well, welcome, Shannon, to the podcast. We are glad to have you here today with us. And to get us started, could you just share a little bit about what your life and leadership looks like right now?
Well, hey, Esther and Holly, it's so great to be with you. I feel honored to be included today. So for me, leadership, I'm not somebody who has that leader title, right? So I don't have a title beside my name, but I do lead people because I'm an author and a speaker. So I often lead from the pages in a book or from a platform. but I lead in a way that I want you to feel like I'm not leading you. So it's a little bit tricky. I try to come along as a friend and just be that girlfriend beside you. So it's a little bit trickier type of leadership. But yeah, I lead from social media. I lead from my website. I lead in writing and in speaking. And hopefully my goal is always to lead you to Jesus and lead you to his truth. My little tagline is inviting you to live like God's word is true. So I want for you to, those that I invite to come along with me or / lead, I'm saying, hey, let's all open our Bibles. Let's all know what the truth is. And then let's live as though that's true.
I love that answer. I'm wondering if you don't mind telling us a little bit about your personal life, where you live, what your family looks like. I'm sure people would love to know that if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So I live in Michigan, and this is the very first summer that my husband and I are trying out the whole empty nest thing. So our youngest still lives at home. He's 17. He'll be a senior next year, but he is away working at a camp. So we are feeling our way through this. We're like, oh my goodness, it's really quiet. And we talk about our dogs an awful lot. Like they're the only ones home right now. So we have an oldest who just graduated from college. She is an accountant. So she's got her big girl job and she moved downtown Grand Rapids where we live. And we're so happy and proud of her. And then we have one who's still in college and he's studying network security. And like I said, we've got a 17-year-old. So we're just doing that transition from like emptying out the nest and what's going to be next. It's kind of fun and exciting, but also a little bit sad too.
Yeah.
So.
I'm not looking forward to that. I feel like we're heading there a lot sooner than I want to admit, but so could you tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and maybe when you realized you were a leader? I know you said at the very beginning, you don't necessarily have that title by your name, but as you said, you do lead through from stages and books and kind of come alongside as a friend. Maybe when did you realize that that was in you and that was something that you could do?
I was trying to think, Holly, when it first dawned on me, and what came to mind is my 4th grade birthday party. I had a sleepover and I remember like having a plan. What I really wanted was to make this an intentional time. And so I had a Bible study and I had all of us sit around the circle, cross-legged, and we had our Bibles and I taught the Bible passage. And then I wanted for us to be creative and come up with a skit. And I was so proud of myself because everybody listened, everybody participated. It was like this thing of beauty, but then it all fell apart when I gave one role of acting out the Bible story to one person and somebody else got mad and there were hurt feelings and jealousy and all this frustration and it all. And I was like, it was going so well, and you know what? Isn't that sort of how leadership is? It's like the leader is the one who has an idea of how it's all supposed to go. And like this feeling of like, yes, we're on the way. But then the leader is also the one who feels the pain when it doesn't. Everybody else just shrugs their shoulders and goes home and takes a nap, because you were at the sleepover and you stayed up all night. But it's the leader who carries that pain of like, oh, it could have been better. So I don't know. I think back to times like that was in me as a little girl. And then I think maybe I took a little break from seeing myself as a leader, in my teen and college years. I was a little bit more invested in measuring myself and comparing against others. I've written a lot about those years. But then, even in those years and as early adult, it's like I just have this thing where I am in a meeting or I'm in a group. And if it's not the way it's supposed to be, I just squirm in my seat. I just can't sit on my hands. I just have to do something. And I think your other question is like, when did I first see this awakening, this leadership thing in me? I recall being in a group where the leader wasn't really leading. And this was in my early 20s. And I kept inserting myself. I kept just trying to guide the group back to the direction that it should go, that our mission and our purpose for the group. And I remember one particular meeting, I was going into the meeting and I was like, okay, I have talked too much. I have led and it is not my place. And I want to support this leader. I want to be humble. At some point in that meeting, something happened where I think someone was challenging something, and I looked at the leader and everybody else looked at me. And I thought, and I said, well, I don't need to answer this. We have a leader. And she said, well, I was kind of hoping you would respond to that. And, that's just the sort of thing that just happens with leaders, so we can put a leader in a role, but the natural leader just rises to the surface. And I think it's that person who has just a deep desire that it would go in the way that it's meant to go, and feels that angst and that frustration when it's veering off track and like you just squirm and you cannot help yourself. So that's sort of leadership, I think, to some degree.
I love that, Shannon. And I can just picture the gals listening to this, out on their walk or driving, and they're nodding their head and they're relating to everything you're saying, because I have been in those exact same scenarios where it's like, this is not what we're supposed to be doing right now. We can do this better. We can make a change. And so often, I think God often leads us into leadership, not necessarily because we want to do it, but because we see the need for that leadership to take place. And he's gifted you in some way to meet that need. So I love that. So we like to hear a little bit about some of the lessons that you've learned on your leadership journey. And even if you want to share into, your current day of speaking and writing and things like that, are there a couple lessons that maybe God has taught you in this leadership journey?
I think one of the biggest lessons that God has just been teaching me as I serve different groups and as I prepare my heart and as I, overlap with different leaders is that humility and leading as a servant has so much greater potential for the spiritual outcomes that we're hoping for than a leader who is trying to take control, who's trying to just clamp down the perfectionist leader. And I am all of those things. Like I have been the kind of leader, back to fourth grade, right? I had an idea and this was not going the way it's supposed to be. And there's just something that rises in me where I want to clamp down and I want to insert myself and I want to boss people and I want to tell them to get back to, doing what I told them to do in the first place. But, that wouldn't go over very well. So if you invite me to your church, I promise I will do none of the above. But I think there's something about sitting on my hands and watching something oh, wow, this could go better. And how can I bring an attitude of humility? How can I bring this heart for, I want to be here and I want to serve this group in a way that is relying on the Lord rather than relying on myself. If I can do that, then, that's one thing that I can bring to this particular group, to this particular weekend, to this particular event. And then I just have to say, I've had so many beautiful, positive examples. I just met with a woman yesterday who I'm going to speak at their camp this fall. And she's like, we're just praying. We're just asking God to lead. We're just thinking of our different women who are coming to, this retreat. She said, we have people who are hurting. They have lost so much. And she said, I would just ask, we're going to readjust our schedule. We were going to do something for leaders at the front end of the retreat. We're going to do something a little bit different, not for leaders. And I just would ask that you would sit in prayer and just ask, that God would lead you. Our team will be praying. And there's just this flexibility in her and this beautiful desire to let God lead all of us together and not casting any sort of judgment or, superimposing well, I was thinking you were going to do this or but it's just this openness and this desire to let God lead her and let God lead me and just bathing it in prayer. So I feel like those are the lessons that I've been learning.
Those are so beautiful. And I just so appreciate how when we kind of enter into different groups when we're a leader that they just teach us such different things based on, like you said, how the group is, how the leadership is, and what the culture is there. So I love that example. I'm wondering, you talked about you have been in contact and been in touch and been around lots of different leaders. Have you had any mentors that have impacted how you lead? And what was sort of the, crux of their message to you that really impacted you?
Yeah, I mean, I've had several mentors along the way. I've had other speakers and authors who've really invested in me, either for a season, working through some particular struggle or hardship. I have one woman who is an author and has just so much wisdom. And she's meeting with me in a couple of weeks just to work through some decisions that I have to make and some difficulties, some pain points, that I'm struggling through. And she just has this godly understanding and she's walked the path before me. Right. And one of the things that I think my mentors often tell me, and there's a friend who lives in my same city and we walk constantly. And this is my friend, Rachel. I think of her as a mentor. This is one of the things she constantly says to me is, you know what, Shannon, you have said all that you would need to say. And now it's time to just be quiet and wait on the Lord and let's see what will come next. I feel like that is a recurring theme because I feel driven. I see the problem. I see the solution. Let's bring this together. And I think just the idea of patience and that my timeline is not necessarily God's timeline. And even if he is stirring my heart in this direction and I have this thing that I feel like God wants me to do, that may very well be true, but it also may very well be true that he doesn't want me to act on that right in this moment, right in this time. And, when you look at the prophet Jeremiah, there were just years and years of aching and groaning and seeing this is not how it's supposed to be. And God wanted him to sit in that. And so I think that has been a recurring thing that my mentors have told me. One other theme that I've had different mentors, or actually my husband and I have an older couple who have invested in us and we get together with them once in a while. And, we've just talked with them about how lonely ministry can be. I often say, really what I want is for there to be a group of people that we get together on the 4th of July and Super Bowl Sunday and New Year's Eve. But really the only times that are open in my schedule are the 4th of July and Super Bowl Sunday and New Year's Eve. That's all I've got. Right. And you can't just formulate relationships out of nothing, out of no time invested. And so, I am traveling this fall. I will be gone. I believe it's every single weekend or invested in some sort of speaking opportunity between mid-September through mid-November. And so, trying to be involved in a small group or be involved on a weekly basis with a group of people, we've tried that before and it's really hard. Often they want to meet on the weekend. And one small group that we were part of, I think I missed a whole semester because I would get home from a retreat and I'd be like, I want to go. It's Sunday evening, but I just cannot drag myself there. I'm spent. I'm exhausted. And so I think I'm thinking of this, again, this older couple that has mentored us. And I think that they've just, encouraged us. Yeah, that's part of the sacrifice. That's part of what God has invited you to invest for this season and for the sake of his kingdom. And I think, really just that has made these little mentoring relationships more precious to me. The time that I do get with people who do what I do and who make these sacrifices, they're very precious to me. And even if I don't get to meet with my mentor, but a couple times a year, right? To have a face-to-face, maybe we would text or interact between those times, but they're just really precious times to me. And, just look forward to those. I do want to just offer a little guidance too. I don't want to give the impression that we should just unplug from everything. I know that somebody listening might hear, oh, I guess it's okay for me just not really be part of my church. And no. I would definitely give the opposite input. I tried that for a few years and that is not good for your heart to always be approaching others from a platform and nobody really knowing you. So I invest in a women's study that meets during the week. But that is often I'm pouring out in that session too, or in that ministry too. And so I think I'm differentiating between being involved and being invested with just that group of friends that you can just be comfortable with. Doesn't your heart ache for that sometimes? And sometimes in leadership and ministry, that has to be set aside for a time.
Mm. Yeah, I think you've made so many good points, Shannon. And I'm like, oh, which thing do I want to talk about first? But one, I want to just mention that what I took from what you were sharing about the mentors that's so important is sometimes mentors say something to us that we don't exactly want to hear,
Yeah.
but that we need to hear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the huge values
Yes.
of having mentors. And then I think the piece that you're sharing about this idea of like the relationship piece is that as leaders, a lot of times we're looking around at everyone else in our church or in our circle who all appear to have
Yes.
thriving, vibrant relationships they're always getting together. They're always doing these different things. And then we're over here saying, well, wait a minute, where is my connection?
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you're saying is it might look different than
Mm-hmm.
what those other friends have, but B, not to just write off that
Yes.
it can happen and that
Yes.
it just takes a little bit more work or it takes initiative or creativity to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are really key things for us to remember as leaders. And yeah, Holly and I are big believers that we need to be involved in our local church and
Yes.
be connected and find those ways to build those relationships, even if it's hard sometimes.
Right. And even if it doesn't look the way that you thought it would look, you know, I grew up with my parents had this group of like 4 couples and they would get together like, I don't know, it seemed like every month and they would have dinner parties and they just were together throughout my whole childhood. They were the couples who gave the kids, you know, the bridal showers and the baby showers. And this was like their core group. And that is not how I don't have that. You know, it's looked different, but that's not to say that I don't have any relationships. I have very rich, deep relationships. They just maybe look a little different than what I had always anticipated or envisioned for myself. Did you notice I'm comparing there?
Well, I was going to say, I feel like we're going to get into comparison,
Yes.
which is a topic, but
noticed I'm doing it again.
Well, and even when I was talking about the issue of relationships and looking around, I mean, that's comparing, right? That's where we get into that. And we think that everybody else has it easier or everybody else, these relationships just dropped into their lap and that, you know, just happened. And really I think that's one of the biggest lies that Satan uses is, you know, keeping us thinking that we're the only ones experiencing the thing that we're experiencing. But before we go there, too deep, we know that a lot of times the leaders that we talk to have a message to share, that God has given them a desire to share something or to meet a need of some kind. And that's what leads them into leadership, like we talked about earlier. So could you share a little bit about kind of when did you start to develop this desire to share a message? And if you want to share with us a little bit about that message, that would be amazing.
Right. Well, I remember as a young 20-something sitting in an audience at a retreat, and there was a woman on the platform and she was telling a story, and I cannot remember who the woman was, and I cannot remember what she was talking about, but I remember she was telling a story about her bathrobe. And I pictured a white fluffy bathrobe. I don't know. That's just what's in my mind. And as she was talking, I just had this deep stirring in my heart. Like, I want to do what she is doing. I think I could do what she's doing. I long to do that. I long to interact with women from a platform over a multi-session retreat or a conference or something like that. And I did not tell anyone about that. I didn't. It was just too private. It felt vulnerable to share that because I was just a young mom raising my kids and there was no time, you know, to be dreaming big dreams like that. I think I was pregnant at the time, but that was just like this little seed that I buried and kind of nurtured, and my heart would just kind of go there once in a while. And then just little by little, that seed started coming to life and God began to open opportunities. So for me, sharing messages began with moms groups. I would speak for moms groups. And then one time I was leaving a moms group and I think this was actually the very first time I spoke at a moms group. My mom and I spoke together and she was mortified. She was like, "Oh, I never want to do that again. It was horrible." And I remember walking out of the room thinking, "Oh, that was awesome. I hope I get to do that again. Like we just had completely different reactions to that. And on the way out the door, somebody said to me, the leader of that group said to me, hey, you should consider pulling that into an article, like writing what you just shared. That was valuable. I could see that being a magazine article. It planted a seed. I had never thought about writing. I liked to write, but I had never tried it. And so I thought, I'm going to work on that. And I think I spent about 3 months worth of nap times working on this article. And then I sent it to the only 2 places I could think of. And that was Focus on the Family. And then a friend who was an editor of a small Christian magazine. And both of them wanted the article. I was like, wow, that is amazing. And at the time I had no idea how hard it was to be published by Focus on the Family. I would have never tried had I known how difficult, how narrow that entry point would be. But that was a beginning for me. I thought, well, this is fun. And then I remember, like, this was years and years ago. This was back when there were yellow pages and people were calling me on the phone and like they would look up. I remember there was one message I left on my answering machine. This was back when there were answering machines too. And I remember this lady called and she had a Southern accent and she said, Shannon, your message, it just meant so much to me. And I played that over and over. I left it on our machine for like a year. It meant so much that I had created something and it had gone out into the world and somebody received that. And it meant enough for her to call me, find my number and call me. This was before I had a website, before I had a blog, before anything. And so that just kind of, I don't know, I was seeing God open doors. I was seeing him just plant this desire to share truth in a way that was, I love to package truth in storytelling. Storytelling is just, I love it. It's what I do. It's what I've always loved to do. And so, it was a way to combine my different gifts and to reach people and encourage them and point them back to Jesus. So I think little by little, that desire for speaking and writing has unfolded, and like that has just grown more and more as those doors have opened.
So it seems like in a lot of the things that you talk and speak about have to do with comparison. And so I'm wondering if you could share what made you want to write or talk about this. Do you have a personal experience? Can you just give us a little bit more information on the background about where this all started for you?
Yeah. So comparison, I think my earliest memories have to do with comparing and measuring with other kids in my class or other girls. I remember going to 6th grade camp and looking across at this girl on the other side of the cabin, and she was from a different school, and she and all her friends, like these were the girls wearing the cute clothes and the makeup and I was like looking like, I don't understand how to be like that. I'm just going to watch and try and figure some things out, and they were talking about how it was way better to take a shower at night than in the morning. And I was thinking like, oh, I wasn't going to take a shower at all because this was camp and I had not brought any shampoo or towel or anything. And so I was like, ooh, what in the world? And I just remember kind of shrinking back into my corner and watching them and kind of just feeling insecure about the whole camp experience because I didn't know we were going to be taking showers. I didn't know we were going to be washing our hair, right? And I was just a 6th grade girl. And that, I think, I noticed that's what happens when we compare. We start retreating, we start pulling back. And instead of using all the beautiful gifts that God has given us, and instead of interacting with others and sharing our lives with them, we just retreat, we just pull back. And I think we can do that in leadership too, right? As I wrote this book, Comparison Girl, it's a Bible study. The subtitle is Lessons from Jesus on Me Free Living in a Measure Up World. And I just looked at basically, what does Jesus say in response to people who are comparing? How did he respond? And we can talk about that in more depth, but basically Jesus, whenever people were comparing the Pharisees or the disciples or the sinners or anybody, he starts talking about his kingdom. He starts saying, well, yeah, you live in this measure up world and that's how things work here, but in my kingdom, it's different. So the chapter in that book that was probably the most hard hitting for me was the one on comparing ministry. because that's where I live, right? That's where I live. And so comparison it's not just a thing that happened when I was a little girl at camp in 6th grade. I mean, it has been carried over into every stage of life and ministry. And so, I remember comparing as a young mom when the kids were little, but now my comparison is more in this space, like comparing with other leaders, comparing with an author whose book has skyrocketed and mine has kind of dwindled, the following, or comparing with another speaker who got invited back to a place that I didn't get invited to, or got invited to a larger platform that I haven't been invited to. And just all of those angsty, icky, nasty feelings that will I hopefully don't allow this to happen, but there is the potential of me just backing into my corner, just like in 6th grade camp, and just retreating instead of sharing my life, sharing my gifts, sharing what I have with the rest of the world. And I call that me-free living, where it's just not about me, where I'm not measuring. I'm not worried about how am I measured up. I'm just serving. I'm just pouring out what I've been given with the rest of the world.
I love that story that you told about you in 6th grade, because I think so many of us can relate to that, where, it may not even be someone saying anything nasty to us. It's just us kind of confronting what else is out there in the world that's different than us. And then we make a snap judgment about ourselves, and it's almost 9 times out of 10 negative, right? 9 times out of 10, it's us shrinking back. And I just love that message for the leaders and the women that are listening, because I am doing the same exact thing that you're mentioning. Why did this person get this opportunity that I didn't get, and vice versa? And it's so hard to stay focused on what God has put in front of my feet, what God has put in my circle. And I think that it's so important what you're talking about. And I do want to dig deeper in these areas. So you have 2 books that you've written. One is Control Girl and one is Comparison Girl. And I'm wondering if you can kind of define these 2 girls and help us figure out maybe if we fall into one of these categories.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So a control girl is someone who feels like not only does she want to take control, but she thinks it's good and it's right to take control. Like somebody has got to control this thing, right? And she feels like even just this urgency, it's an important mission that she is on to get and keep and take control. And often in life, God just invites us to be doing the opposite. And really, it stems all the way back in the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve took that fruit, they were really taking control for themselves. This was the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And so that knowledge of good, the difference between good and bad, that is only kept safe when it's kept from us. And they wanted that for themselves. They wanted to be like God. They didn't want to be deferring to God. And so many times, actually all the time, God calls us back to that. His original intention in the garden is that we would be deferring to him, asking him to tell us what is good for us and what is bad for us. And always living in surrender. That's how things were set up in the garden in the beginning, is that they would live in surrender to him. So that's kind of the issue with control, right? A comparison girl is someone who measures herself against others and who, like, I use this measuring cup metaphor where I've got the kind with the red lines on the side. And a comparison girl puts her cup next to somebody else's, and she feels good when she has more in her cup than somebody else. And she feels icky and awful, like Holly, like you said, 9 times out of 10 when she has less in her, or she's feeling like I have less in my cup than somebody else. And, Esther, like we talked about earlier, sometimes we're just looking at a picture on Instagram and we're making these assumptions like they have all these friends, or they have all of this wealth, or whatever it is that we're looking and comparing. And so comparison girl is always looking at somebody else and either feeling less than or greater than. So the response to control is surrender. The response to comparison, it's not as intuitive, it's humility. Because really, when I'm comparing and I'm feeling good because there's more in my cup than somebody else, isn't that kind of pride, right? Isn't that like lifting myself above them, as if something in my cup was not first given to me by God, right? Or if I have less in my cup, now that really doesn't feel like a pride problem. It feels like this icky. But in a sense, what I'm saying when I feel all icky about the fact that somebody else got this speaking assignment or somebody else got this writing, their book is doing awesome. What I'm saying when I feel all icky and angsty about that, what I'm saying is, yeah, I'd really like that to be me. I don't like the fact that that's me. I feel this jealousy. I feel this frustration that God didn't put what was in her cup in my cup. And there again, that's pride. And humility is saying, you know what, God, you have put whatever is in my measuring cup, the amount that you've given me, the gifts, the talents that you have given me, you have arranged that all according to your purpose for me. And it is true that you put more in some cups and less in others. And that's all about you being God. So I think we're kind of back to surrendering and submission and his sovereignty at that point. But humility says, I'm just going to take whatever you have given me and I'm going to use it in whatever capacity level and whatever opportunities that you allow me to have. I'm going to take that measuring cup and instead of focusing on the lines, I'm going to focus on the spout. I'm going to do what Jesus did. You know, Philippians 2 says that Jesus did not consider equality with God, that's a measuring word, a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself out. He poured his life out and made himself a servant. And that's what greatness looks like in the kingdom of God. Greatness is not about measuring. Greatness is not about comparing, even the serving that you get to do versus me. Greatness in the kingdom is all about humbling myself, emptying myself, serving, bending low, lifting others up. It's just a whole different way of looking at the world and ourselves through this lens of humility.
Mm. Thank you so much for sharing the difference between the control girl and the comparison girl. And I think that as some of us are listening, we might be getting a little bit of that Holy Spirit nudge on which one we tend towards.
Yes.
And then also, I loved this. I had to write this down. You said the response to control is surrender, and the response to comparison is humility. And I think that is that's so, just to boil it down and simplify it. And you're right, like this issue of leadership, the way we as believers approach leadership is just the opposite of what a lot of the world speaks about. And Holly and I have done a whole episode about that idea of it's really about service and, like you said, pouring ourselves out instead of looking at how can I get more people to follow me or to look at me or to see what I'm doing. So really good points here, Shannon. So, we like to talk obviously about leadership on this podcast. And you have shared with us that you have some ways that comparison can destroy your leadership and your leadership plans. And so I would love to hear more about that. How can comparison impact or destroy our leadership?
First of all, it divides us. Like picture that sixth grader pulling back. Comparison is always about pulling away from each other, and it's either this comparing and feeling less than or comparing and feeling superior. So I think the first thing the negative effect of comparison is that division. But then, there can be bondage either in the pride or the superiority. Those are both negative as well. I think as leaders, when we pull away from other people, and we feel intimidated and insecure around others, and, we can't learn from them, right? We can't grow from allowing ourselves to be close enough that others might see our flaws, or that we can ask those questions like that reveal, okay, I don't know what I'm talking about here. I have a sense of, I have a need here, and I'd really love for you to speak into it, but that takes some humility, right? And so when we're feeling that less than, intimidation, insecurity, that can just wrap us up, right? It can just kind of wrap its little, I'm picturing like an octopus, just wrapping you up with all 8 of its arms. Like it just won't let you free. This intimidation and insecurity and fear of what others think. So there's just bondage and feeling that intimidation and that insecurity, but there's also bondage in pride and superiority. I think we've all gotten to see through the COVID experience how those of us who have been around church the longest, been around ministry the longest, I think we feel like we know more. We have this entitlement. Like if they would just listen to us. And I don't know about your church, but there have been like two camps of people at my church who both feel that way. I've been around. I know what I'm talking about. Like, please listen to me, but they're polarized. They're different. And so there's this superiority of, I have put my time in here and y'all need to just listen to me. And also like a disgust of looking down at others who see it differently. I don't know if you've experienced that at all, but I had someone where I stepped out of a car somewhere. I was walking into a building and a leader said, "Oh, you don't have to put a mask on. We're not stupid here." And I thought, oh, wow, that's actually saying something about other places where, you do have to put. I've also encountered someone who yelled out a window and said, "Put a mask on, stupid." Right. And so in both of those, now I don't hear any of those sorts of things in church usually, but those attitudes are certainly surfacing in our churches and in our ministry settings. Like, you're doing it wrong. You're stupid. There is this condescension that comes along. Like, we cannot express disgust without also expressing a sense of superiority and condescending pride. And I think that is also polarizing. Like, that adds to the polarization, those attitudes. We feel those. You don't have to say a word. If that's in your attitude, we all feel that. And so I think all of those can really hold us back as an individual or as a group. It can hold us back in our leadership where we have these divisions, or we're pulling away in inferiority, the bondage of inferiority, or we don't think of it as bondage, but this superiority, this pride of looking down on other people can really hold us back individually and in groups as we lead. That will only increase the division and the polarization in our communities or our organizations.
I so appreciate the example that you gave, because I think that it's super blatant, but I want to just say, and I think that, so much of this goes on inside of our heads. Like, we may not even vocalize any of it, but at the same time, it still has as much power as if it was said out loud, because that changes how we behave. If we're thinking in these ways, if we're letting comparison cripple our minds, we are dealing with this inferiority or superiority, and that changes our behavior. And so it does create those divisions, and, just as much, I would say, as if it's said out loud or whatnot. And I think that it's something that creeps up on us that we don't realize is happening until we kind of catch ourselves in the point where we just say, like, well, why am I treating that person this way? Why do I have these thoughts about them? Why da-da-da-da-da? And then we have to confront what is actually going on in our head.
Yeah. But I do think, Holly, that we have a certain comfort level around those who agree with us.
Yes. Yeah.
In a way that we, it may be going on in our head, but if we can group up with those who agree with us, and where there's, we're all in agreement, there's a uniformity there. That sort of disgust, when we start voicing it in those circles, that's where disgust gets radicalized, right?
Yes.
And I think our heart craves being around people who agree with us. But here's what I picture, if I group up, like, let's take the whole mask situation. Yeah. I'm a leader in my church. And if I can get around some other leaders or some other people who agree with me and say, look at these people who, let's say, I'm not going to tell you which way I was thinking or responding, but just for the sake of the illustration, let's say that I thought everybody should be wearing masks, And so I grew up with my little group, and I am saying, look at these people who are walking into our building and they don't even have a mask on. They are not loving their neighbor, right? And they're all nodding in agreement. So what that does, two things. It reinforces my bias, right? It reinforces that. But then it's like, I almost picture there's this balloon, and every time that I demonstrate or express my disgust, I'm like blowing into this balloon, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And on the balloon is the word pride. And it's just inflating and inflating and inflating disgust, and being able to express my disgust with people who are like me. It just inflates my pride. And so what I've found really helpful is for there to be groups where we don't all agree and to invite that sort of interaction. I was actually leading a group of people this year where everybody was sort of in agreement. And I had said several times, like, y'all, we need to be very careful about how we're speaking about those who we disagree with. And I think, just bringing up some of the concerns that I have that I've just shared with you is like, I feel like there is this pride that can grow in our hearts when we express this. We just need to really be careful. Well, then about halfway through the year, someone joined this group who was of a different mindset. And we, I think, grew more in that time and that place, because you know what that called out in us? We love this new person who's joined our group, and we want to consider others, Philippians 2, consider others more important than yourself, and not just be voicing the way we see it and what we would like to see happen, but like, no, our heart is for her as well. And we want her to be welcome. And you know what? We may disagree. Like churches across America and the world have discovered, like, oh my goodness, there are more people in my church that I disagree with than I realized. And I don't know about your church, but we've worked really hard on diversity. And the great irony is there is far more diversity. Like our church, we all kind of look alike each other. We don't necessarily represent the community that we're part of, and that's a problem. But what we've recognized, or at least I have, is, there was more diversity, not in just what we look like, but that is really good for us to be looking at each other and recognizing. And like you said, Holly, like this stuff that was in my heart, it's coming out in a group setting with people who see it differently than me. And so what can I learn about myself? How can I grow? How can I grow in this beautiful heaven acclaimed art of humility? Like, how can I consider others more important than myself in this situation?
Okay, I'm over here like all the amens, all the praise hands, because this is a topic we could talk about for hours. But I really loved how you brought out this idea of superiority when it comes to comparison, because I almost never hear about it in that light, right? Like when I think of comparison, I think of how I'm usually looking at other people and saying like they have something more, or they're better, or they can do X, Y, Z, and I can't. That's usually what comes to mind when I think about comparison. I almost never think of comparison like those times when I am thinking, oh, I am better at this, or I have this 100% right and everybody else is wrong, which is what you're talking about with this issue of disgust. It's like when we get into that mindset of the way that I believe about this topic or issue is the only way, and I absolutely have no room for disagreement in my life. And I'm not going to even entertain a conversation or when I disagree with somebody. And that is such a huge problem in leadership in the Christian church today.
Yes. Yeah. I was just going to bring that back to leadership, because leaders are tasked with leading, obviously, right? And casting vision. And so those of us who are leading, this needs to be the vision that we are casting, is unity is different than uniformity. Look at what we're told about the body of Christ. It is not a uniform body of people. If it were, why would we need unity, right? If we were all exactly the same and had the same, what we brought to the body was exactly the same, why would we need unity? And I mean, 1 Corinthians 12, it's all about, remember there's the part that says, well, I'm certainly not needed here because I'm the foot and you're I don't remember what parts are named, but then the opposite side of the problem too. Well, you're certainly not needed here because I'm this. And both of those are completely wrong. And as leaders, we've got to cast vision for this humility of, no, God has arranged this body the way that he sees fit. And he has put all of these very unique, different people together in our local churches and our local groups that we're leading, our local organizations, but then also the capital C global church. And I love that you brought up, Esther, that whole like superiority. I know that when I write a book about comparison, that's really what people are. They're coming with the angsty less than feelings like, oh yeah, I want this book, because they really want to deal with those And I know, Holly, we said 9 times out of 10, that's what we're feeling. But as women have read this book and studied this book, what I keep hearing repeatedly is exactly what you've said is, oh, I was not thinking about all of the ways that I compared down. And the first chapter of the book sets up the problem. The second chapter is comparing my sin with your sin. And oh, this is such a problem in the church, or calling things sin that aren't really sin. But yeah, just the superiority, it can create so much division in the church. And we've all experienced a leader who is a superior type leader and who sees themselves as elevated and condescending, and who does not see their own sin of pride, that is like with I in the middle. And as a leader, I just think humility will serve us so well, right? Because as pride grows in our hearts, that just holds us back in the kingdom of God.
Oh my gosh, I feel the same as Esther. I'm just like praise handing over here. Because I think so much of what you're talking about threads through so many of the topics that we've discussed and that we feel really passionate about here. So I'm like, and I feel like we could talk about this forever, but we only have so much time. So I kind of want to ask you a few more questions about leadership as we kind of wind down to the end here. So I'm wondering if you can share a piece of advice that you might give to another woman who wants to grow in her leadership, someone that maybe is coming up behind you and is seeing the things that you've done in your life and just wants to grow in that area. How would you encourage her? What advice would you give to her?
Yeah. So I have written a book called Influence, Building a Platform that Elevates Jesus, Not Me. And so in the whole speaking and writing world, a lot of the questions that I get from others has to do with platform. And my friend Kate Motang and I wrote this book kind of like, if we were going to sit down for coffee with you, here are the stories we would share with you from our experiences. Here's what we would tell you. And a lot of the things that I wrote about in that book had to do with control and comparison, because these are my issues as a speaker and a writer. I always want the message to be for me. And, as we talk about building a platform, that is something that we cannot necessarily control. And as we build a platform, we're often comparing with the person beside us whose platform grows like in an instant. Suddenly they have 1 million followers and we've been working at it, and just sharing faithfully for years. And so, I think really the advice or the encouragement that I would give is to just do the thing that God has put in front of you right now and right here, and do it with all that God has given you. Don't hold back. Don't wait for the opportunity that you are hoping for. Just go ahead and serve. For me, it started with serving little kids. That's where I kind of grew up as a speaker and as a writer. This will probably make no sense to anyone but a writer, but I served at a church where we didn't have a curriculum. We had a really creative children's director. And so we basically got a sentence and we had to build our lesson off of this sentence, So I would spend like 20 hours a week when it was my turn to teach. It was a large group of kids. And I would spend like all of this time researching and studying because I wanted my lesson. First, I wanted to make sure I was theologically sound, and I wanted to bring the very best that I could. And so it was like all my nap time, for like 2 weeks, I would put into this message. And then after I shared it on a Sunday, I would come home and all afternoon I would be in the office, like writing it, like typing it out. And my husband would come in and say, "What are you doing again? I don't understand. Like, you taught the lesson." And I'd be like, "I know, it just doesn't feel done until I've like written it all." And I would like edit it and arrange it because I just wanted it to be like a complete thought, a complete idea. And those are just in files somewhere on my computer. I don't know. They've never been used. But that was my training, and I didn't realize that at the time, that God was stirring this in my heart, that someday I was going to be asked to speak not for kids, but their moms, and that someday I was going to be asked to write. And all of those years and all of that study and all of those Sundays of writing where nobody could see, that was really preparing me for something that God had for me in the future. And so I think that those of us who are gifted in leadership and to serve in these various ways, like that is not going to go wasted. If you give 110% to even your local church, even the little ministry that you're part of, what happened for me is I was asked then to, oh, could you come and serve in this area? And then, oh, can you speak at the moms group? Oh, she did a great job. Could you come speak here? And it's just incrementally grown over time. And I'm so thankful for the timeline that it hasn't grown any faster than it has, because like I told you, I'm going to be gone, or I don't know if we mentioned this before recording, but I'm going to be gone like from mid-September through mid-November. And I'm just spending this summer working on different writing projects, getting caught up and getting prepared for my fall. I could never have done that with little kids. There is no way. And it has grown exactly at the pace that God intended for me. And I think too, I love the parable of the talents. I love the fact that the master in the parable gives not the same amount, because Jesus could have told the story a lot simpler. Here's what he could have said, like, one guy got 3 talents and the other guy they both got 3 and one buried it. He could have told it a whole bunch of different ways, but instead he said, they had different amounts. And what I love about that parable is that the guy who got 2 doubled it and the guy who got 5 doubled it. And they both received exactly, like if you take those texts in the Bible and put them side by side, they are word for word the same from the master. Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been entrusted with little. Now you'll be entrusted with much. Enter into your master's happiness. And so both of them, and it does not matter how much was in their measuring cup. One had less than the other. It does not matter how much they poured out. One was able to double it to 10 and the other was only able to double it to 4. It doesn't matter what they were able to produce or, the quantity of what their output. All that mattered was that they took what they were given and they were faithful and they both were rewarded. And so what that means to me is every single woman listening to this podcast has every opportunity to hear exactly what, the most well-known speaker, writer, leader will hear someday. We have exactly the same opportunity because all we have to do is be faithful with what we have been given. And then just one more little point that I want to add is, I'm often asked to speak for groups of maybe, 100 to 500, right? Mm-hmm. And I have friends who are often asked to speak for groups of 1,000 to 5,000. And if I were to put my hands on my hips and say, well, I'm not going to speak until I'm asked to speak for the 5,000 group. Well, my platforms where I have been asked to speak would be empty, right? Like there would be no speaker there, or at least not the one that God intended to be there, because he's asked me to speak in those places. And that's not to say that if I'm asked to speak for larger audiences, I won't. But I think that there's something in us that always wants more, always is driven to growing and bigger and better. And that is not the way of the kingdom of God, right? And many times it's these small, faithful ways of just using what we have particularly been given by God and investing and growing that. Spiritual fruit grows different. It grows slower. It takes longer, and we will not be able to see until heaven where the spiritual fruit has taken root and where it's grown. And so I think just being faithful in the place that God has placed you and knowing that he has put you exactly where he wants you. He has given exactly the amount of gifts that are needed for that position, and just be faithful and stop measuring your faithfulness versus someone else's.
I know that is going to encourage a lot of women who are listening, because I think we all tend to think about that bigger platform, that bigger stage, that next thing that maybe God is calling us to, and that takes our eyes off what he's given us to do right in front of us. So it's so important, such a good lesson to encourage the women with. So as we wrap up, we always like to ask this question because we believe leaders are learners. And so we like to hear, is there one resource, either a podcast episode or a book or, other resource that you've listened to or watched recently that you feel like would be helpful to our audience that you'd want to share with them?
Can I give you more than one? It's so hard to narrow.
I know it's hard. It's hard. Yeah.
I'll just tell you the podcast that have been really encouraging to me lately. I really love Alyssa Childers' podcast. I feel like that has just been really helpful. And I love Carrie Newhoff. Man, I feel like the guests that he has on that show, I'll never probably get to talk to them. So I feel like I get to listen in and learn from them as leaders. And I also love the Ed Stetzer Leadership Podcast. So those are some of my favorites right now.
I actually have never heard of that last one, so I'm going to have to check that out. Okay. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. Ed Stetzer wrote a book called Christians in an Age of Outrage. I think I got that title right.
Oh, I've heard
so
of
maybe
that.
that would be
so good.
Yeah.
It's I just listened to that this year, and it's
Did
so
you?
good. Yeah.
So the whole disgust thing that we talked about, a lot of my help came from that book. It was really, really helpful. And that was written years ago, I think. So, I feel like it's been a really great resource for this season.
Yeah.
So we so appreciate this conversation that you've had with us. And I would love for you to share, if someone wanted to get more in touch with you or wanted to learn more about you, read about your books, all of those type of things, where could people connect with you? And if you have anything that you'd like to offer our audience, this would be the time for that.
Oh, thanks, Holly. Yeah. ShannonPopkin.com. You can find all of the different, books and resources that I have for you. And maybe we can share a link. I do have a little leader giveaway, a little bonus pack that I would love to share with anybody who wants it.
Awesome, Shannon. Thank you so much for being here. And yes, we'll make sure those links are in the show notes. And we really appreciate what you've shared with us. Just the insight and the wisdom that you've shared today has been so helpful. And I'm excited to share this with our audience as well.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Such a joy to connect with you all and with our listeners.
Thanks for joining us on the Christian Women Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, come and join us in our private Facebook community. We would love to get to know you better so that we can make sure the podcast is providing what you need. Plus, you can share your questions and ideas, and you'll be surrounded by incredible Christian women leaders. To join the group, visit estherlittlefield.com/group. Now, don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.